A former adult film star executed a man inside a national park. The victim, someone who she once accused of rape. The woman once known as Selena Savage on OnlyFans is in prison. She pleaded guilty to murder, but she is not going quietly. Why she says what she is ordered to do behind bars isn't fair. We're on the case, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Stewart. Selena Savage has a shocking life story. Now, much of it moving forward is going to be spent in prison. Her real name is Chelsea Perkins, and she wasn't always making explicit content for work. She's actually a Coast Guard veteran, and she claims to have a very traumatic past. She claims that that past was her motive when she committed murder that she pleaded guilty to earlier this year. Now, the big update that we are following in this case is a real shocking new claim that she appears to be making from federal prison. So before we get into that, let's lay out this case, including what happened after the fact, after this murder, when someone went to shocking lengths to try to kill Perkins, aka Selena Savage, months after she killed a man in an Ohio national park. Yes, there are a lot of layers to this story, so let's break it down. On Instagram, Perkins, again, identified herself as Selena Savage. She was a, quote, cam model. Perkins' last post on Instagram was December 9th, 2021. I want you to remember that date. Now, earlier that year, on March 6th, Perkins drove to Ohio to meet 31-year-old Matthew Dunmire. According to court documents, Dunmire and Perkins go way back. They both went to high school together, and so they knew each other for many years. Now, heading into this weekend, Dunmire told a friend that he was going to meet up with a woman who was in town for the weekend. In fact, his boss saw him get into a car with a woman who drove a white vehicle. Also want you to remember that part. Now, on March 6th, the two go to Cuyahoga Valley National Park, which is a beautiful park, has incredible views like this, and it's also a quiet place to get away from the hustle and bustle of Cleveland or Akron in Northeast Ohio. On March 9th, a few days later, around 11 o'clock in the morning, hikers found Dunmire dead. He had a single gunshot wound to his head. At that time, Perkins was nowhere to be found. During the investigation, police did speak to some hikers who remember on the day of Matthew's murder that they heard a gunshot and they passed Perkins, who seemed lost in the woods. They noted that it was odd that she was wearing knee-high boots walking through a national park, and we're not talking about hiking boots. Now, Perkins eventually made her way out of the park, and then she drove across state lines to Michigan to a tattoo parlor, and then she eventually made it back to her home in Virginia. That's where her husband lived, and her husband owned the white vehicle that Matthew's boss saw him getting into before he went off and was murdered. It took several months to arrest Chelsea Perkins. Police say eventually they were able to line up Matthew's cell phone data with the location of an Airbnb rental that Perkins had booked for the weekend that she was in Ohio. Her DNA also showed up on Matthew's body and a water bottle that was near his body after she shot him in the back of the head. Now, Perkins was arrested in December of 2021, specifically December 10th. And that's why her last post on Instagram as Selena Savage is December 9th of that year. For as clear as the evidence seems in hindsight, it took several months for law enforcement to arrest Chelsea Perkins. And during this time, this story took an even more shocking turn. I promise you, you're not expecting it. So a little more than a month before Perkins was arrested, a woman was shot in Northeast Washington, D.C. And the shooter, according to the Justice Department, wore a brown vest and brown baseball cap and was carrying a cardboard box. They knocked on the front door and they shouted, quote, UPS. They shot the woman who answered the door. The person dressed like a delivery driver shot the woman who answered the door. Later, we would learn this was the woman who was dressed like a UPS delivery person. This was the shooter. Her name was Tommy Lynn Dunmire. She's the mom of Chelsea Perkins' murder victim, Matthew. Government prosecutors say that Tommy Lynn and her longtime partner, a man by the name of John McQuillan, drove to a house in Washington, and they had the intent to shoot Chelsea Perkins. The couple had grown frustrated by November that no one had been arrested for their son's murder, and they really believed that Chelsea Perkins was responsible, so they decided to take matters into their own hands. Now, the problem was that the woman who answered the door, who Tommy Lynn shot, wasn't Chelsea Perkins. It was a woman who had nothing to do with Matthew Dunmire's murder. Now, that shooting victim survived. Tommy Lynn and her partner, John McQuillan, then tried to escape by changing their license plates. Police eventually caught up to them, and at that point, they say Tommy took her own life. Hey, before we continue, I want to pause and talk about something many people deal with: debt. It can feel like it's not an accident. Every call, every fee, every high-interest trap, it can leave you feeling stuck. Banks profit, creditors win, and real families lose. But today's sponsor, PDS Debt, helps people fight back. Whether it's credit cards, personal loans, or medical bills, PDS Debt has customized options to help you pay off debt faster. No minimum credit score required. Plus, they're A+ rated by the Better Business Bureau. You might know people struggling with debt, looking for a way out, and this can help. It's your money, it's your future. Don't let the system decide for you. You're 30 seconds away from being debt-free. Get your free assessment and find the best option for you right now at pdsdebt.com/OTC. That's pdsdebt.com/OTC, pdsdebt.com/OTC. Now, McQuillan, Tommy's longtime partner, he pleaded guilty in 2022 for his role in the shooting, and he was sentenced to 3 years in prison. Perkins no longer lived in the Washington, D.C. area at the time that Matthew's parents went to try and kill her under the disguise of being a delivery driver. Perkins, though, was arrested in Pensacola, Florida. Court records show that the motive for the murder of Matthew Dunmire was, in the mind of Perkins, revenge. Court records show that she accused Matthew Dunmire of rape in 2017. The Cleveland Plain Dealer newspaper in Ohio says that police in Virginia Beach, where Perkins claimed the rape happened, didn't have enough evidence to support a charge. On May 27th of this year, so a couple of years have passed, we've made it to 2025, Chelsea Perkins pleaded guilty to driving more than 300 miles across state lines and killing Matthew Dunmire. She pleaded guilty to a charge of second-degree murder. Perkins was sentenced in September to 22.5 years in prison. She faced sometime between 20 and 25 years in prison, so it appears the judge found right down the middle as what her punishment was going to be. And she is currently in federal prison at a facility in West Virginia. Now, along with that 22.5-year prison sentence, the judge also ordered Perkins to pay restitution to Matthew Dunmire's family. The amount was $596,000. That is the amount that the court says pays for Matthew's family's travel expenses for them to get to court because they lived out of state, and it pays for Matthew's funeral expenses, but it's also an estimated amount of the money that Matthew would have made in his life if he were still alive. He worked as a musician. Now, in this court document obtained by Law&Crime, Perkins is disputing the amount of money related to the future earnings. It reads, quote, "No pay stubs, tax filings, sworn affidavits, or expect analyses were produced to verify the length of this employment, consistency of his hours, or what reasonable living expenses he may have incurred." Prosecutors countered by calling the amount a, quote, "conservative calculation," and they argue that they have met their burden. They say, quote, "She should not now be able to avoid paying into his estate, which one day will belong to his minor children, by claiming that he did not make any money despite having a full-time job and being capable of work. To order otherwise would be to give defendant a windfall despite her crime." This week, court records show that Perkins and prosecutors agreed during a status conference over Zoom that they would work together to determine what a resolution could be in this case when it comes to the issue of restitution. But it didn't appear that those negotiations went on for very long, because they met on December 2nd. Then on Thursday of this week, December 4th, the government filed another document saying they could not reach a deal, and the court should order Perkins to pay that nearly $600,000 amount that she was already ordered to do. At this point, it's unclear how the court could rule what happens next. Joining us now is former Deputy Attorney General of the state of Ohio and Prosecutor Mark Weaver. It's always great to have you on Law and Crime, especially when it comes to cases like this that happen in your state, though this one was federal. When it comes to the argument over restitution, how strong of a case does it seem that Chelsea Perkins has?
Yeah, pretty strong case. Now, every time victims look for restitution, You have to see whether they're exaggerating the expenses or asking for too many things. But for crimes of violence, federal law makes it very clear that the victims, in this case the children of the murder victim, are entitled to compensation. And one of the big ones is the money that this man would have made in his career had he gone on to live a life and provide for his children.
What goes into calculating that? Who's the person who's responsible for figuring out what that money would be?
Hey, your viewers might be surprised to know that there's actually an industry of people who do this. These are actuaries and accountants and experts who can look at somebody's career path and make guesses essentially of what they would do. This person was a musician, so it wouldn't be fair to say, well, he's going to be as big as Taylor Swift if he had lived, and so therefore the compensation should be tens of millions of dollars. But a musician can expect to make some money in their life, and I'm sure he did other things as well to make a living. And so it's easy for an actuary to look at tables that show what most commonly is done for people like this and then provide an estimate.
I don't know financially what Chelsea Perkins' situation is, especially at this point when you think of maybe lawyer fees and all of that, but she's going to be in prison for 20 to 25 years. Like, how does she pay that amount of money?
She probably doesn't. This is often a legal fiction, as we call it. We're requiring somebody in prison who at best is making a little bit of money doing prison work to help them pay for candy and personal supplies at the prison commissary. We're expecting that person to pay that judgment. Often this is a symbolic thing, that the person should be held accountable. Of course, she's not that old. If she lives a long life, she could get out of prison, and then she would have her paychecks docked, a certain amount of money, to pay for this restitution.
How does that work in terms of, say she gets out of prison eventually? I mean, if she'll live years after serving her time on this 20 to 25 year sentence, how do you determine, who determines how much she's going to pay each year for the rest of her life?
Well, typically this is overseen by the parole department or the probation department that set up the original order. It's not done by a judge. It's done by federal employees whose job it is to monitor compliance with inmates when they leave the system. This very well might be made a part of her parole obligations when she leaves prison.
And then just looking at this case in general, she accused the victim, Matthew Dunmire, of sexual assault many years ago. She didn't have the evidence to prove it. Sometimes those cases are difficult to prove. What do you make of that aspect, just looking at how this case played out, that was allegedly, I mean, she was convicted, but her motive, she said, was this, what sounds like a very traumatic thing that she claims happened to her years ago?
Yeah, if this man is a rapist, he deserves to be put on trial and sent to prison. I don't know if he was or not. She claims he was. Hollywood and TV and movies have given us this sort of exciting portrayal of a woman who's going to make things right by hunting down and forcing her rapist to be responsible for what he did. It makes for interesting movies, but in real life, what we're all obligated to do is not do the second crime. So if you become a crime victim, she says she was a crime victim, you have two things you can do. You can press criminal charges and you can bring civil lawsuit for money. That's what you can do. What you can't do is go out and commit murder, because if you do, you're going to prison.
And I remember when, we first covered this story, and the idea of taking this man to a park on a hike, almost coaxing him in to think that they were going to have some sort of conversation or connection in some way, and then she executed him in cold blood. How common do you see crimes like this? Because the story, and then there's the whole other aspect involving Matthew Dunmire's family and what they tried to do to Chelsea Perkins. Just what do you make of I know that these types of cases have major impacts on people's lives, but it just seems so many different people went about it in ways that so many different lives were ruined because of what happened.
Yeah, that's a good observation. I'm speaking to you from a prosecutors conference, and if I were to grab some of my fellow prosecutors and invite them into our conversation, I think most of them would agree that Most of the crimes we deal with are ones that are spur of the moment, driven by alcohol, driven by an immediate bad decision. Only rarely do we get these very carefully thought out crimes where the person who's eventually going to do the murder spends all this time preparing for it. I wonder what was going through the mind of this victim as this woman was getting ready to lure him out into the woods. One account, some witnesses suggested that they bumped into this woman after she committed the shooting, and she was wearing thigh-high boots, which are not hiking boots. And so the victim must have known that they weren't dressed to go out hiking in the woods. It makes you wonder what she said to him to be able to lure him out to that very far away location where she could commit the crime.
And another part of this, and again, it doesn't excuse it, but it took a long time. You know, when you think of seeing someone in the woods, they don't have the boots on. I mean, she commits this crime in a national park, and then she flees to another state. You know, this becomes, you know, this federal case, and then you have Matthew Dunmire's mom and stepdad. They end up spending time in prison because of, you know, trying to kill Chelsea Perkins. How do you as a prosecutor, and this probably goes to the law enforcement level as well, when you have an investigation that's taking time, keeping the family in the loop, knowing that it's not something that's gone cold, that you understand you're trying to build a case, so you don't have someone like this family did, allegedly trying to go after someone and taking justice into their own hands?
Yeah, we look at this case, and we sometimes use 20/20 hindsight. We go, look, it's clear she was angry at him. Why couldn't the authorities, the FBI, why wouldn't they know? Well, they didn't have that. They have a dead body, someone who shot in the woods. And she was from not his current life, she was from his distant past life. She was not even from where he was living at the time. And so it's kind of a long shot to find somebody like they did. It took a while. Your other question, though, was how do you deal with the family who wants justice for their murdered loved one? And that's one of the hardest parts of being a prosecutor. I've sat with family members of people who've died, and they're just heartbroken, and they want something to be done. And we, as law enforcement, we want to help them, but we also have an obligation to put together a case that can be proven beyond a reasonable doubt to a unanimous jury.
What are some of the reasons that a case like this ends up being a federal case as opposed to something that authorities in Ohio would prosecute?
Yeah, there's two bases for federal jurisdiction here. One is when you commit a crime across state lines, you start the crime in one state and you go to another state. That could be a state or a federal prosecution. But in this case, it was held at a federal national park, so it's on federal property. Many of your viewers have watched NCIS, the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. They are the investigators when the crime takes place on federal property involving the Navy. That's one of the ways NCIS gets involved. So when it's federal property, give you an example. I actually got a parking ticket once at a federal park, and if I wanted to challenge it, I had to go to federal court, which is kind of crazy to think about it, but the infraction occurred while I parked in a federal park, and so if you want to go fight it, you're going to be in federal court, not your local traffic court.
How does the prosecution of someone in a case where if this had happened, you know, on a street in Cleveland, that it would have been something that a prosecutor in Cleveland would have tried? In this situation, because it was in a park, there's multiple states involved, it ends up being a federal charge. How do the prosecutions typically differ when trying to figure out whether someone's guilty and then you have a sentence?
Yeah, the prosecutors at the state and federal level have to talk to one another because this could be a state crime. There's something called the dual sovereign theory, which says that the double jeopardy clause of the Constitution that prohibits someone from being put in jeopardy twice for the same crime, it doesn't apply when there's a state charge and a federal charge. Now, if the federal charge is almost exactly the same as the state charge, that could be a problem. But in theory, this woman could be charged for something in Ohio should the prosecutors in that county want to pursue that.
We see often when people are, you know, they face a sentence, even taking a plea deal, they don't serve an entire sentence. And in this case, she gets 20 to 25 years. How likely is it, because it's in a federal prison, that she would actually serve between 20 and 25 years as opposed to getting out early? Like we do see that happens in some states.
Sure, and I can compare that to Ohio. At Ohio, she would do most of those years. Under the federal system, particularly with some of the recent changes in sentencing, if she behaves herself, if she doesn't get in trouble in prison, she can carve a few years at least off that sentence. And if she's a first-time offender, I can't remember from the notes whether she is. I think she was. That's an additional time she can take it out. So if she behaves herself, you could expect her to be out in 15 to 18 years.
And then on top of that, knowing that it could be 15 to 18 years, like you go through, and we were just talking about it, like this was not a crime of passion in the moment, where she has an argument with Matthew Dunmire and she shoots him. This was something that was planned. This was calculated. This was driving to flee to another state and then trying to hide from it until she was eventually arrested. What do you make of the sentence here that she was given, the plea deal that went forward, that she's getting 20 to 25 years, where in some states, she'd be serving the rest of her life in prison if this went to trial?
This is the nature of guilty pleas, right? Each side has to give something. A plea bargain is a contract, essentially, and just like any contract, each side has to receive something of value in order for it to be enforceable. So in this case, the United States Attorney's Office from the Northern District was relieved of their obligation to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. And the defendant, the murderer, she was relieved of the possible penalty of spending much more time in prison.
And then I know this is probably a good question too that a lot of people at your conference could answer, since you're a prosecutor yourself and surrounded by several prosecutors. But when you're in plea negotiations, how do you balance, okay, I can get this person to plead guilty, we got him, and you balance that with, well, she's only going to be spending, in this case for a premeditated murder, 20 to 25 years, if not less. How do you balance that as opposed to saying, this is someone who definitely should serve more time in prison, and I feel good about our case, and we're going to follow this all the way through and put it up to a jury?
Well, I prosecuted a lot of child sex cases in my career, and so a lot of times I'll weigh in whether or not I want to put the child on the stand and make their life more difficult and re-victimize them potentially. In this case, we don't have a victim who could take the stand because she's dead, so that wouldn't be a consideration here. But you do want to give some certainty to the family. What you tell them is, if we get this the plea bargain and the conviction, there won't be any appeals. You won't have to come back over and over again and hope the appeals court doesn't send it back for another trial. So it does give them some closure. It's one of the things we talk about with families when we encourage them to consider blessing, if you will, a plea bargain. Although we always have to remind them, it is the prosecutor's decision. It's not the family's decision. Me, on behalf of the state of Ohio, I represent the entire state of Ohio when I'm bringing a case, not the family of the dead person. And so it's a difficult conversation. There's a lot of tears, a lot of prayers, a lot of people being very upset. But the important thing as a prosecutor is I want to listen to them, let them have their say, and then make the best decision.
And then with that, if this had gone to trial, like typically what does the federal appeals process look like? Where if she felt like it was unfair for whatever reason, and I don't know, again, how much money she has, where if she could afford the attorney fees to bring those appeals, but how long does it take for someone to actually successfully, in some cases, appeal a conviction on a crime like this?
Yeah, she would be entitled to a public defender for an appeal, whether she could afford it or not. The appeals process is, by design, slow. It's not months, it's years before an appellate court could overturn a verdict. And that typically requires the defendant, in this case the person who shot this man, she would have to come forward and point to a mistake in the trial, either a mistake that violates the law or the Constitution. And then, in addition to finding a mistake, they have to prove to the appellate court that it would have changed the outcome of the verdict if there had not been that mistake. So it's not just enough to say there was error. That's called plain error. There has to be what's called reversible error, which means got to prove we would have had a different result if that mistake had not been made. It's a very high bar. Most of the arguments I've made on appeal, I think all of my appellate arguments on behalf of criminal cases have been upheld by the Court of Appeals.
And we'll see how this one plays out. Chelsea Perkins, who pled guilty to this premeditated murder, sentenced to 20 to 25 years, but arguing that point of restitution. Mark Weaver, prosecutor, former Deputy Attorney General for the state of Ohio. Thank you as always for being with us on Law&Crime. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me back.
That will do it for On the Case, presented by Law&Crime. Subscribe to us on YouTube and Spotify. I'm Chris Stewart. We'll see you next time.